The glimpse of a ghost the city was a symphony of impatience. A river of gleaming metal and angry horns under the oppressive late afternoon sun. Inside his silent, climate-controlled luxury car, Julian Thorne was an island of frustrated tension. His fingers, long and deft, tapped a restless rhythm against the polished leather of the steering wheel. On the dashboard, his phone glowed with a relentless stream of notifications emails from his tech empire. Messages from anxious investors, reminders of a life that demanded every second of his existence. He sighed, a sharp exhalation that did nothing to ease the tightness in his shoulders. Another merger, another negotiation, another victory that felt increasingly hollow. The traffic lurched forward a mere few inches before stopping again. Leaning his head back, he rubbed at his temples, trying to push away the beginnings of a headache. The cacophony outside was a dull roar, a sound he usually tuned out but today felt grating against his nerves. His gaze, unfocused and weary, swept across the crowded sidewalk opposite him, and then it stopped. A woman was struggling with an overstuffed grocery bag. The paper bottom gave way, sending oranges and cans of soup rolling across the pavement. She bent, her movements slow and heavy. With a visible weight, one hand going to the small of her back, the other cradling the pronounced curve of her stomach. She was pregnant, very pregnant. Something about the weary slope of her shoulders, the way a strand of dark hair stuck to her damp forehead, felt like a punch to his gut.
Ow.
Then she stumbled. It was a slight, almost graceful sway, but it was wrong. Her hand flew out, grasping for a lamppost that was just out of reach. Julian's breath caught in his throat. The city's noise faded into a distant hum. Because he knew her. Even from across the street, even after all these months, he knew. The line of her neck, the way she held herself even in exhaustion. It was Clara. Clara Evans. The woman he had once vowed to love forever, now standing alone on a busy street. Her life literally spilling out at her feet. Julian Thorne had built an empire from a dorm room idea. He was the boy genius who became a titan of industry, a man who commanded boardrooms with a quiet intensity that left no room for argument. He was admired, feared, and envied. He had a penthouse that overlooked the city, a collection of vintage cars, and a name that opened every door. But in the silent, cavernous spaces of his life, there was only a profound, echoing emptiness. The victories were celebrated alone, the meals eaten at a table meant for 10, the nights spent in a bed that felt far too large. He had everything he had ever thought he wanted, and it meant nothing. Have you ever stood at the pinnacle of success, only to find yourself utterly alone? Tell us in the comments below. Sometimes in the dead of night, his mind would drift back. Didn't feel like memory, felt like a ghost limb, a phantom pain of a life he had amputated. He saw a small apartment that always smelled of garlic and old books. He saw mismatched mugs and a sofa with a broken spring that they'd promised to replace. He saw her face, illuminated by the glow of his laptop screen, as she leaned over his shoulder, her voice a soft murmur in the dark. "This is brilliant, Julian. They'd be fools not to see it." Her faith had been the bedrock of his ambition, the fuel that kept him coding through the night when doubt was a cold knot in his stomach. He remembered one night in particular. He had come home after a venture capital meeting had gone disastrously wrong. His confidence was shattered. "It's over, Clara," he had muttered, collapsing onto their worn rug, his face in his hands. They tore it apart. "It's never going to happen." She had knelt before him, her hands firm on his wrists, pulling them away from his face. Her eyes, a deep, steady brown, held no trace of doubt. "It is not over," she had said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You will try again tomorrow, and the next day. You will make them see, because you are the most brilliant man I know." In that moment, he had believed her utterly. She had been his compass, his true north. But the compass had broken. As his company exploded, so did his absences. First it was late nights at the office. Then it was weekends spent schmoozing clients. The whispered "I'm sorry"s became texts sent at midnight. The promises of a vacation became empty words. Lost in the whirlwind of EPO filings and acquisitions, He was building a future for them, he told himself. He just didn't see that he was dismantling their present. Brick by painful brick, Clara had tried to hold on. She'd tried to join his new world of galas and charity auctions, but she was a quiet soul in a room of roaring egos. He'd find her tucked away on a balcony or deep in conversation with the catering staff, a polite smile on her face that never reached her eyes. "Julian," she'd said one night, her voice small in the vast silence of their new, expensive bedroom. "Do you even see me anymore?" He'd been half asleep, his mind already on a conference call scheduled for 5 a.m. "Of course I do," he'd mumbled, turning away. It was a lie. Now, he saw the idea of her, the fixture in his life, not the woman who was slowly fading from loneliness. Right beside him, the end had been quiet, which was the worst part. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed doors, just a Saturday morning where he found her sitting at the kitchen island, a single suitcase at her feet. Eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. "I can't do this anymore, Julian," she'd said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I feel like I'm a ghost in my own life. You don't need a wife. You need a portrait on the wall to complete the set." He'd been stunned, speechless. By the time he'd found the words to protest, to beg, she was gone. The door clicked, shut with a finality that echoed through the empty halls for months. A furious blast of a horn behind him shattered the memory. Julian blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. His eyes snapped back to Clara across the street. She had managed to gather a few of the scattered items, but her face was ashen. She took a step, then her legs simply folded beneath her. She crumpled to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. Without a second thought, Julian threw his car door open, ignoring the angry shouts of other drivers. He vaulted over the low median, his expensive shoes hitting the pavement with a slap. "Clara." He called out, his voice rough with a panic he hadn't felt in years. She turned her head weakly. Her gaze, clouded with pain and disorientation, found his. For a heartbeat there was confusion, then a dawning, awful recognition. Her eyes widened, not with relief, but with something that looked like shame. Then her eyelids fluttered shut, and she went completely limp. He reached her just as her body sagged sideways, catching her before her head could hit the concrete. She was so light in his arms, so frighteningly fragile. "Clara. Clara, can you hear me?" He murmured, lowering. Then both to the ground, cradling her against his chest. Her skin was clammy. "It's me. It's Julian." Her lips moved, a faint whisper lost to the city's din. Her hand, limp at her side, twitched, and then came to rest on the swell of her belly. The protective gesture was instinctive, primal, and in that moment, the final, devastating piece clicked into place. The pregnancy. It wasn't just that she was unwell, she was carrying a child. "Clara," he said, his voice urgent now, shaking her gently. "Is it the baby? Talk to me. What's wrong?" "Just tired," she slurred, her words thick. "So tired." "You fainted," he insisted, his fear sharpening his tone. "That's not tired. That's he cut himself off." Arguing was pointless. He had to move. "We're going to the hospital now." A weak protest formed on her lips, but no. Sound emerged, her head lolled against his shoulder. That was all the answer he needed. Shifting his weight, he gathered her up into his arms, her head tucked against his neck. She felt insubstantial, a wisp of the strong woman he had known, carried her through the stopped traffic, ignoring the stares. His entire world narrowed to the feel of her shallow breathing against his skin and the terrifying, spoken question hanging in the air between them. He bundled her into the passenger seat of his car, his hands trembling as he fastened her seatbelt. As he slid into the driver's seat and slammed the car into gear, he cast one frantic look at her pale, unconscious profile, at the life he had. So carefully constructed was crumbling, and all that was left was the terrifying, urgent need to save the one thing he had already thrown away. The sterile, antiseptic air of the hospital was a shock after the city's exhaust fumes. Julian stood frozen just inside the automatic doors, his arms still aching with the ghost weight of Clara's body. A flurry of motion erupted around him. As nurses descended, their faces masks of professional calm. They guided Clara, now slumped in a wheelchair, through the swinging double doors and into the bowels of the emergency room. He took a step to follow, but a firm hand on his arm stopped him. "You'll need to wait here, sir," a nurse said, her voice kind but leaving no room for argument. "We'll take good care of her. Someone will be out to update you soon." The doors swung shut with a soft hiss, cutting him off. The silence in the waiting area was profound, broken only by the low hum of a vending machine and the distant, tinny echo of a paging system. He was alone. The adrenaline that had propelled him through traffic, that had given him the strength to carry her, drained away, leaving a cold, hollow dread in its place. He paced the small, worn carpet, the pattern of faded blue diamonds blurring beneath his feet. Each minute felt like an hour, each tick of the clock on the wall a hammer blow against his skull. His mind replayed the moment she fell in endless, horrifying slow motion. The way her eyes had met his, not with a plea for help, but with a flash of pure, undiluted mortification. He had failed her. The thought was a cold, sharp stone in his gut. He, Julian Thorne, who could orchestrate billion-dollar deals and command a room of the most powerful people on the planet, had been rendered utterly useless by the sight of the woman he once loved collapsing in the street. He had been so absorbed in building his fortress of success that he hadn't noticed the person he'd built it for was starving outside the walls. The swinging doors opened, and a doctor emerged, his face unreadable. Julian's heart seized. "Is she?" "She's stable," the doctor said, cutting off his panic. "The baby's heartbeat is strong and steady. She's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from extreme exhaustion. We're hydrating her now and will keep her for observation. She needs rest, proper nutrition, and consistent prenatal care. She's lucky you got her here when you did." The relief was so potent, it made his knees weak. He sagged against the wall. "Thank you. Can I see her? She's sleeping." "Best thing for her right now is rest. You can sit with her in a little while?" The doctor gave a brief, professional nod and disappeared back through the doors. Julian finally sank into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his head in his hands, malnourished, exhausted. The words didn't compute. This was Clara, who grew herbs on their tiny apartment balcony and could make a gourmet meal from the most meager ingredients. Clara, whose energy had once felt limitless. What had happened in the months since she'd walked out? He had, in his arrogance and hurt, assumed she was fine. He'd pictured her in a new apartment, starting a new life, perhaps even seeing someone new. The thought had been a bitter pill, but it was one he'd forced himself to swallow. He'd never, not for a second, imagined this. He must have dozed off, because the sound of hushed voices from the nurses' station jolted him awake. The shift had changed. 2 new nurses were speaking in low tones, unaware he was within earshot. Evans in room 4-1 was saying, her voice laced with sympathy, "No insurance." Her file is flagged. "Bills from her previous prenatal visits are months overdue. I don't know how she's been managing." The other nurse sighed. "It's always the hardest cases. I heard from day shift she's been couch surfing, maybe even living out of her car for a while. Can you imagine? And in her condition?" The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Living out of her car? The image seared itself into his brain. Clara curled up in a cold vehicle, her pregnant body trying to find rest on a cramped back seat. Overdue bills? He thought of the endless zeros in his bank accounts, the frivolous purchases he made without a second thought. A cold fury, directed entirely at himself, began to boil in his veins. How could he have been so blind, so selfish? Couldn't sit still any longer. He stood and moved quietly down the hall, peering into the slightly ajar door of room 4. Clara was awake. She lay propped up on pillows, an IV line snaking from her arm. She looked small and breakable in the hospital gown, her face turned towards the window, watching the first hints of dusk color the sky. The harsh fluorescent light washed her out, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes, the new sharpness. To her cheeks, he pushed the door open slowly. "Clara." She turned her head. The vulnerability he saw there was quickly shuttered behind a familiar, weary guard. "Julian." Her voice was a rasp. You didn't have to stay, of course. I stayed, he said, moving to stand awkwardly at the foot of her bed. The space between them felt like a canyon. How are you feeling? Like I passed out on a sidewalk, she said, a weak attempt at her old dry humor that fell flat. She looked away again, her fingers plucking at the starch hospital blanket. Thank you for bringing me here. Clara, he began, his voice tight. The nurses, they said. Is it true? Have you been living in your car? Her shoulders stiffened. A long moment of silence stretched between them, so heavy he could feel its weight. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low, he had to lean in to hear it. It's not a convertible, surprisingly roomy. The joke was a defense mechanism. One he remembered well. It shattered what was left of his composure. Why? The word burst out of him, raw and anguished. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me? For God's sake, Clara, you're pregnant. She finally met his gaze, and the look in her eyes a mixture of profound exhaustion, defiance, and a deep welling sadness stopped his heart. Because I didn't think you'd care, Julian. Her voice was trembling now, losing its careful control. Not after everything. You had a whole world to run. My problems were just inconvenient. You know that's not true, he insisted, though the words sounded hollow even to him. What proof had he ever given her to believe otherwise? Do I? She asked, her voice gaining a sharp, brittle edge. You barely noticed me when I was your wife, living in your house. Why would my being homeless and pregnant suddenly command your attention? She took a shaky breath, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her stomach. I didn't want your pity. I didn't want to be another problem for you to solve with your checkbook. I just wanted... She trailed off, shaking her head as if the rest of the sentence was too painful to utter. Wanted what? He pressed, desperate to understand. To handle it myself. She whispered, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her temple, into her hairline, to prove I could. But one thing went wrong, and then another. My job was cut. The freelance work dried up. I lent my savings to a friend who never paid me back. It was like quicksand. She closed her eyes, the admission seeming to cost her the last of her energy. I was managing barely, but I was managing. Julian stared at her, at the proud, stubborn set of her jaw, even in her utter defeat. The full, devastating picture was coming into focus, and it was a masterpiece of his own neglect. He had been so busy building an empire to impress her. He had failed to be the man she needed. He'd been the quicksand. He moved to the side of the bed, his hand reaching out before he could stop himself, hovering just above hers where it rested. On her belly, you won't have to manage anymore, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She didn't pull her hand away, but she didn't look at him either. She just turned her face back to the window, to the gathering darkness outside, as if looking for an answer in the fading light. The silence that descended was no longer just empty. It was filled with the echoes of every missed opportunity, every unspoken word, and the terrifying, fragile hope that it might not be too late to finally hear them. The silence in the hospital room was a physical presence, thick and heavy, with everything left unsaid. Julian stood by the window, watching the city lights begin to prick the evening darkness. Each one a tiny, distant star in a world that felt suddenly alien. Clara's confession hung in the air between them, a specter of hardship and pride that left him gutted. He had offered help, a lifeline thrown into the churning waters of her life, and she had just stared at it, too exhausted to even reach out. He turned from the window. You're not going back to a car, he stated, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. It wasn't the gentle tone he'd intended, but the image of her trying to sleep curled up in a vehicle, protecting the life within her. It ignited a fierce protective fury in him. I'm getting you an apartment today. Somewhere safe and close to the hospital. Clara's eyes, which had been fixed on the pattern of the blanket, flickered up to him. The weariness in them was bottomless. Julian, you don't have to. I'm not doing it for you, he interrupted, the lie tasting bitter. He softened his approach, moving to sit in the chair beside her bed. I'm doing it for the baby. It needs a stable environment. You both do. This isn't a negotiation, Clara. It's a necessity. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for any hint of condescension or obligation. Finding only a stubborn, desperate determination, she finally gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," she whispered, the word a surrender that seemed to cost her dearly. "Thank you." The following hours were a whirlwind of his making. Phone calls were made from the hallway, his voice a low, commanding murmur. Real estate agents, accustomed to dealing with his corporate acquisitions, were now tasked with finding a fully furnished, safe, and immediately available apartment. He settled her astronomical hospital bill with a wave of his phone, the digital transaction taking less time than it took for a nurse to bring Clara a cup of Jell-O. Was in his element, solving problems, removing obstacles. But with each solved problem, the larger, more terrifying question loomed. Why was he doing this? Obligation? Guilt? Or something else? Something he was afraid to name? A nurse entered with a warm smile. "Time for a quick check on the little one," she said, wheeling in a portable ultrasound machine. "Let's see how they're doing in there." Julian moved to stand, to give them privacy, but Clara's hand twitched on the blanket. "You can stay," she said quietly, not looking at him. It was a small thing, a crack in the wall, but it felt monumental. He sat back down, his heart beginning an odd, nervous rhythm. The nurse squeezed cold gel onto Clara's exposed belly. The room was filled with the sudden, miraculous whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of a rapid heartbeat. Julian's breath caught. It was one thing to know intellectually. It was another to hear. The undeniable proof of a life, a tiny, vigorous engine churning away. The grainy black and white image flickered to life on the screen. A small, curled form, a prominent head, a tiny hand seeming to wave. The nurse moved the transducer, and the image shifted, a new angle coming into focus. The doctor chose that moment to enter, glancing at the screen with a practiced eye. "Ah, excellent," the doctor said, his voice cheerful and loud in the tense room. "There's your little one. It's looking perfect. Strong heartbeat, good size. For dates, everything looks textbook." He clapped Julian amiably on the shoulder. "Congratulations, Dad. You've got a healthy baby in there." The word landed in the room like a bomb. "Dad." Julian froze. His entire world narrowed to that single syllable. His eyes, wide with shock, snapped from the screen to Clara's face. She had gone pale, her lips pressed into a bloodless line, her own gaze fixed rigidly on the ceiling, refusing to look at him. Her silence was more deafening than any denial. The doctor, blissfully unaware of the cataclysm he had just triggered, finished his notes and left with a final, "Keep up the good work." The door clicked shut. The only sound was the relentless, happy whoosh of the heartbeat, a cruel counterpoint to the silence strangling the room. "Clara," Julian said, his voice a hoarse scrape. He stood up, the chair legs screeching against the floor. "Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head. Her eyes were wide with a deer-in-headlights fear, and in that look, he had his answer. It was a confirmation that shattered him. "Is it?" Couldn't finish the sentence. The words wouldn't form. He gestured weakly toward her stomach, his hand trembling. "Is it mine?" She didn't speak. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her temple. She didn't need to. Her silence, her shame, her fear, it was all the confirmation he needed. The air left his lungs in a rush. He stumbled back a step, bracing himself against the wall. A maelstrom of emotion, shock, a terrifying, overwhelming joy, and then a tsunami of pure, unadulterated rage swept through him. "How could you not tell me?" The words exploded from him, louder than he intended. "Clara, my God, Dad. A right to know? That's my child?" "What right?" She shot back, her own voice gaining strength, fueled by a defensive fury. "What right did you earn? You weren't there, Julian? You weren't there when the test turned positive? Weren't there for the first terrifying doctor's appointment? You weren't there for any of the morning sickness or the back pain or the nights I was so scared I couldn't breathe." She pushed herself up on her elbows, her face flushed. "You were busy. Too busy for me. Too busy for our marriage. Would this be any different? You would have seen it as another complication, another demand on your precious time." Each word was a lash, and they landed with brutal accuracy. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but the protests died in his throat. Because she was right. He had been that man. He had been so absorbed in building his legacy that he had blinders on to everything else. The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a vast, desolate wasteland of regret. He sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. "You're right," he whispered, the admission tearing something inside him. "You're absolutely right. I was a terrible husband. I was absent. I was selfish." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "But this, Clara, this changes everything, does it?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Or does it just mean you now feel obligated? Because I don't want your obligation, Julian. I don't want to be a duty you resent. It's not obligation," insisted, leaning forward, his voice desperate now. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm asking for a chance to be different. Not the man I was, but the man I should have been. The man you and this baby need me to be." His voice dropped to a raw whisper. "Please, let me prove it." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers where it rested on her stomach, over the life they had created together. He didn't touch her, just left his hand there, an offering, a plea. Clara looked from his face to his hovering hand. The fight seemed to go out of her, leaving only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped. She was silent for a long time, the only sound, the steady heartbeat of their child filling the space between them. Finally, with a shuddering breath, she slowly turned her hand over, palm up. A silent invitation. A sob caught in Julian's throat. Carefully, as if touching something infinitely precious, he lowered his hand until his fingertips brushed her palm. Then he gently covered her hand with his, feeling the warmth of her skin, the firm curve of her belly beneath their joined hands. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a truce. Fragile, tentative bridge built over a canyon of pain. But it was a start. And as he felt the faint fluttering movement beneath his palm, a tiny kick, he knew he would move heaven and earth to make sure it held. The new apartment was a world away from the sterile white of the hospital room. Sunlight streamed through large windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air. It was spacious, tastefully furnished, and utterly silent. Clara stood in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself, as if holding her own pieces together. The move had been a blur of Julian's efficient commands and movers, who handled her meager box of belongings with a care that felt alien. "It's too much," she said again, her voice small in the vast, quiet space. She gestured vaguely at the plush sofa, the fully stocked kitchen. "This is a solution. I needed a patch." Julian set down the last box marked "Kitchen Fragile." "You and the baby need stability, not patches," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This isn't about grand gestures, Clara. It's about foundations. Safe place is the first brick." She didn't argue, just nodded, her gaze distant. The wall was still there, but it had developed a door. He was determined to learn how to open it without forcing the lock. The grand financial fixes were easy for him. The daily, intimate work of building trust was an entirely new language he had to learn, and he was a fumbling, clumsy student. His first attempt was dinner. He'd seen a recipe for a simple lemon herb chicken that promised to be foolproof. He was the fool it hadn't accounted for. The kitchen soon filled with the acrid scent of burnt garlic and the alarm of the smoke detector. He was frantically waving a towel at the shrieking device when a soft sound made him turn. Clara was leaning against the doorway, one hand supporting her lower back, the other covering her mouth. But she wasn't coughing. She was laughing. A real, genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You know," she said, her voice laced with amusement, "they deliver food in little boxes. It's a modern marvel." A reluctant smile broke through his frustration. "I was trying to be domestic," he grumbled, though his chest felt oddly light at the sound of her laughter. "Stick to spreadsheets." "Ah, Thorne," she said, shaking her head as she moved past him with a wince, her hand going to her belly. Picked up the spoon from the counter, giving the charred mess in the pan a dubious poke. The kitchen is a minefield for the overconfident. He watched her, this new version of her, tired and round, and still capable of teasing him. It was a glimpse of the woman he'd fallen in love with, and the sight was more nourishing than any meal could have been. He made it his mission to attend every prenatal appointment. Sitting beside her in the waiting room, a stark contrast to the other expectant fathers scrolling through their phones. He listened intently, asking the obstetrician questions about fetal development and birth plans, with the same focus he'd once reserved for market analysis. One afternoon, after a particularly thorough checkup, she turned to him in the parking lot. "You don't have to come to every single one, you know," she said, her tone not unkind, but probing. "I'm used to handling things on my own." "I know you are," he said, holding the car door open for her. "But you shouldn't have. And I want to be here. I need to learn this too." She was quiet on the drive home, but he caught her looking at him once, a thoughtful, almost wondering expression on her face. The small, shared moments began to weave a new tapestry. He assembled a crib, muttering curses under his breath at the incomprehensible instructions until she took them from him, her fingers tracing the diagrams with an easy understanding he lacked. He learned to rub the ache from her lower back, his touch initially hesitant, then growing more confident as she sighed and relaxed under his hands. They spent quiet evenings on that too-large sofa, not talking, just existing in the same space. The silence between them slowly transforming from awkward to comfortable. One such evening, he found her in the nursery, not assembling furniture, but simply sitting in the rocking chair, her hands resting on her stomach, a look of such profound sadness on her face that it stole his breath. "Clara?" he said softly from the doorway. She jumped, then looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's nothing," she said, quickly wiping a cheek. "Just hormones." He entered the room, kneeling before her chair so he wouldn't loom over her. "It doesn't look like nothing." She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on her hands. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper. "I'm just so scared, Julian." The admission seemed to cost her everything. What if I'm no good at this? What if I can't protect them? What if I'm all alone? The raw vulnerability in her words shattered the last of his defenses. He reached out, covering her hands with his. "You're the strongest person I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you won't be alone, I promise you that. I'm terrified too, but we can be terrified together. It's better than being terrified alone, right?" A sob escaped her, and then she was crying in earnest, great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from a deep, hidden well of fear and loneliness. He didn't try to shush her. He just stayed there on his knees, holding her hands, letting her fall apart, silently vowing to be there to help put the pieces back together. When her tears subsided, she looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I never needed the Empire, Julian," she whispered. "I just needed you to see me, to choose us." The truth of it landed in his soul with the weight of a lifetime of regrets. "I'm choosing now," he said, his voice raw. With sincerity, "I'm so sorry it took me this long to see what was right in front of me." Leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss of promise, of reverence, of a love that had been buried but never truly extinguished. It was an intimate, non-romantic, yet profoundly connecting gesture that spoke more than any grand declaration could. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. A single, clean tear tracked down her face, but this one felt different. It felt like a release later, as they sat together on the sofa, her feet in his lap. He finally voiced the fear that had been gnawing at him. "I thought if I built something magnificent, it would make me worthy of you," he confessed, his fingers gently massaging her swollen ankle. "I was such a fool. I built the palace and forgot the queen." Clara placed her hand over his, stopping his movements. She didn't say anything. She just laced her fingers through his and held on, her head leaning back against the cushions, a small, weary, but genuine smile touching her lips. The wall was still there, but the door was now open. And for the first time, Julian felt he was finally on the right side of it, not as an intruder, but as someone who was patiently, earnestly, learning his way back home. He World was a soft, blue-gray pre-dawn when the pain pulled Clara from a fitful sleep. Why? It wasn't the usual dull ache or the practiced tightening she'd grown accustomed to. This was different. A deep, insistent pressure that wrapped around her lower back and clenched her abdomen with a primal, undeniable force. She lay still for a moment, breathing through it, hoping it was a false alarm. But as it eased, only to return minutes later with even greater intensity, a cold thrill of fear shot through her. It was too early. Her hand fumbled for the phone on the nightstand, her fingers trembling so badly she misdialed twice. He answered on the first ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. Clara. Ah! It's time, she managed to gasp as another wave began to build, her knuckles white around the phone. I think it's happening, Julian. I'm scared. Don't move. I'm on my way. Just breathe, okay? I'll be there in 10 minutes. The next 10 minutes were an eternity measured in contractions. When his key turned in the lock and he burst into the apartment, his hair wild, his jacket thrown on over his pajamas, the fear in her chest loosened its grip just a fraction. He didn't hesitate. He was at her side in an instant, his eyes wide, but his hands steady as he helped her to her feet. We got this, he murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her panic. The drive to the hospital was a blur of streetlights and clenched teeth. He drove with a focused intensity, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her knee, a constant grounding pressure. The world had narrowed to this car, his presence and the powerful, rhythmic demands of her body. Then they were in the bright, sterile chaos of the delivery room. The world dissolved into a haze of pain and encouragement. Julian never left her side. His hand was there for her to crush. His voice was in her ear, a steady stream of "You're amazing and you can do this, and I'm right here." When she screamed at him to stop, saying just a little longer, he managed a strained laugh and whispered, "You're right, you're right, you're a warrior." Hours bled together. Exhaustion threatened to consume her. But just as she felt she had nothing left to give, a new, overwhelming urge took over. The room, which had been a cacophony of pain and effort, suddenly stilled. There was a final, monumental push, a feeling of release, and then silence, a heartbeat of pure, terrifying silence. And then it was broken by the most beautiful, most furious sound Julian had ever heard. A sharp, indignant cry that filled the room, a powerful declaration of life. A nurse placed a tiny, squirming, perfect being on Clara's chest. All Clara's exhaustion vanished, replaced by a wave of such pure, unadulterated love that it stole her breath. "Oh," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. "Hello, you." Julian stared, his own vision blurring. He hadn't known a human heart could hold this much, could feel this much without breaking. He saw the tiny, perfect fingers, the shock of dark hair, the rosebud mouth. He saw Clara's face, transformed by a radiant, awestruck joy. In that moment, every mistake, every regret, every moment of loneliness was incinerated in the fierce, brilliant light of this new life. He reached out a trembling finger, and the baby's tiny hand wrapped around it with a surprising strength. A sob escaped him. "She's perfect," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, she's perfect." The days that followed were a beautiful, exhausting chaos. The pristine apartment was soon strewn with tiny clothes, burp cloths, and the sweet, milky scent of newborn. With the same relentless focus he'd once applied to corporate acquisitions, Julian devoured parenting manuals. He asked the nurses endless questions. His phone filled with videos on swaddling and bathing. His first solo swaddle was a comedy of errors. The blanket was too loose, then too tight, the baby squirming free with a disgruntled whimper. "Like trying to fold a very angry, very small burrito," he muttered. Frowning in concentration, Clara, watching from the bed with a cup of tea, let out a tired but genuine laugh. "You're overthinking it," she said, her voice soft. Setting her cup down, she moved to his side. "Here, like this." She guided his hands, her touch, light and sure. Together, They tucked and folded until the baby was snug and secure, her fussing subsiding into contented sleep. Julian looked from the peaceful baby to Clara's smiling face. "See," she said, "a good team." One night, after a particularly long bout of fussing, Julian was pacing the living room, the baby finally asleep in his arms. He was humming a tuneless melody, swaying gently in the moonlight filtering through the blinds. He felt more than heard Clara's presence. He turned to find her leaning in the doorway, watching them, her expression unreadable. "You're good at this," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "I'm trying," he whispered back, afraid to break the spell. "I still feel like I'm making it up as I go along." "Welcome to parenthood," she replied with a small, sleepy smile. She walked over, standing beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm as she looked down at their daughter. "But seriously, Julian, you're a natural." Her words settled deep in his chest, warmer than any praise he'd ever received. This was the only review that had ever truly mattered. Weeks passed, marked by sleepless nights and quiet, sun-drenched mornings. They took walks in the park, the three of them, a unit. They learned each other's rhythms, their silent language. The past was not forgotten, but it was no longer a wall between them. It was a foundation, however fractured, upon which they were building something new. One evening, the baby was asleep in her crib, and a rare peaceful silence settled over the apartment. They sat together on the sofa, not talking, just sharing the space. Julian turned to look at Clara, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a table lamp. She was more beautiful to him now than ever before, etched with the gentle marks of motherhood. "And a hard-won piece, you know?" he began, his voice quiet in the hush. "I never thought I'd get a second chance with you." With all of this, Clara looked at him, her gaze soft and unwavering. She didn't speak immediately. Reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. She brought their joined hands to her lips and pressed a gentle kiss to his knuckles. "You earned it," she said simply. And as she leaned in, and her lips met his in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with the promise of a future they would. Right together, Julian knew. This wasn't the ending of their story. It was the beautiful, messy, glorious beginning. It was finally home.